Today, this afternoon, we'll be talking about this book. I'll talk through some of its theoretical influences, the existing literature, how it relates to that, and approaches to sources. I think it's quite interesting in this case. And then I will look at some of the key themes and arguments of the book. And when I look at those themes and arguments, I'll kind of mirror the structure of the book. So look at how disaster was understood in this period. How did those in control of the Caribbean relate to its environment? Look at the kind of short-term, the immediate responses to disaster in the hours, the days and the weeks afterwards, and then look at the overarching kind of negotiations that happened, these very long drawn-out negotiations about relief that happened afterwards. So this book is primarily, I suppose, a work both of British colonial history and environmental history, but it also draws on insights from critical disaster studies. And I want to take a moment just to examine or kind of explain what critical disaster studies is about, because I realise talking to historians of all different stripes that may not be familiar with that. So hopefully we can see here now, I'll explain a bit about this. So it's a school of thought, critical disaster studies, and it argues that there is no such thing as natural, emphasis there on natural disasters, but rather that disasters are the products of hazards and human-created conditions. So you can see here on the right here, the hazards, the things that we traditionally refer to as just a disaster, but the hazards here, so, flooding, sea level rise, or in this case, in this book, hurricanes, volcanic eruptions, and they interact with human-created conditions, right? So we can see things like, power structures, resources, training, these sorts of things. So it's when hazards come together with vulnerability that we get a release, as it's called in this model, or a disaster, right? So this school of thought, I think, is really interesting for a historian because many of these aspects that create the vulnerability to disaster are things that develop over time, how society is structured, who has access to resources. So the historian has a really interesting role to play in understanding how disaster is created. And I think more broadly, this framing is really important because it allows us to move away from a simplistic way of understanding disasters as purely natural events. We might think of how African Americans in New Orleans were subject to a century of discriminatory mortgage lending, which left them disproportionately housed in areas that were known for decades for their flooding, right? In that context, Hurricane Katrina was no natural disaster. So, thinking about this context of disasters and what creates disasters, the Caribbean is a really fascinating region for study. It's subject to many natural hazards, most notably hurricanes, which occur annually, but there's also regular seismic activity which produces earthquakes and volcanic eruptions, like this one so strikingly captured by the British painter Turner. The Caribbean was also subject to 4 centuries of occupation by a number of colonial powers, all of which that occupied that territory with the primary aim of extracting wealth. As a British historian, I became interested in understanding how the British Empire responded to disaster because I saw that there was 2 key tensions they would have to deal with. Firstly, Britain was traditionally very reticent to spend money on its colonies, right? But these disasters created great human and financial losses that needed an injection of financial relief to restart that extraction of wealth. And secondly, these are societies that were built on slavery, where the white population existed as a small, fearful minority, and disasters destroyed their plantations, the police stations, the barracks, that they really saw as essential for maintaining their control. So the existing research that explores British colonial responses to disaster is, particularly at the time I was writing, was relatively slim. And it predominantly focused on responses to famines in Ireland and India. I'm thinking particularly here of Mike Davis's excoriating late Victorian holocausts. So in terms of my work, there was a clear gap in the literature, and there's also a key difference, right? These books study slow onset disasters, right? Famine is a slow onset disaster. And my book studies what in the literature is referred to as acute or rapid onset disasters. And they create a whole range of different concerns, particularly in societies with such potential for civil unrest, like those in the Caribbean. I settled on a period covering the 19th and early 20th century because there was one major work, Matthew Mulcahy's Hurricanes in Society, which had already covered the 17th and 18th century. And the exact date of my book's coverage were defined in part where his ended. So he ends with a disaster known as the Great Hurricane that happens in 1780, and I begin looking at the eruption of La Soufrière on St. Vincent in 1812. And thinking about this timing as well, the kind of the time frame of the book brought me on to what I thought was going to be a major challenge of writing the book, which was deciding the disasters I was going to cover. There were, of course, hurricanes between 1780 and 1812 where I start my book, but actually I found it when I was doing the research relatively easy to identify the disasters that were worth covering because they left the most significant traces in the archives. So the eruption of 1812 was a rare event, and it sparked a great flurry of communication across the Atlantic. And the main part of the book ends with the Jamaican earthquake of 1907, which, despite preventing the book being neatly framed as a 19th century study, I felt really it was essential to include this because I'll talk about it later in more detail, but the response exemplified so many of the themes that I talk about in the book. You know, these colonies, the Caribbean colonies, obviously suffered disasters after 1907. I do mention a hurricane in Belize in 1931 in the conclusion, but the outbreak of the First World War and the Depression that followed really inaugurated a new era in the Caribbean that had quite different political constellations that I felt were really outside of the scope of the book. So that's why I pretty much kind of ended in 1907. So whilst the challenge of choosing the disasters was relatively easy, and that was dictated by the scale of what was available in the archives, one challenge that was harder to overcome relates to the sources themselves. On a pragmatic level, there was the handwriting. So this is a diary written as the volcano explodes in 1812. So you had the handwriting challenge of going, okay, trying to work out what was being written here. But so this book is primarily based on records from the Colonial Office held at the National Archives in Kew in London, and it was augmented with records of British parliamentary debates and Caribbean and international newspapers, and where possible, first-hand accounts like this, a diary extract here, from these who endured these events. And the challenge really was that while they all came together to build a vivid and detailed picture of these disasters, they were almost entirely all written by white elites either in the Caribbean or white elites back in the Colonial Office, right? So colonial secretaries, members of parliament, and other invested parties back in Britain. Right, and that obviously shaped the perspectives that the sources offered, right? It obviously complicated it because there was very few different perspectives to counterbalance them with. You know, as Saidiya Hartman once put it, right, the encounter with the archive of slavery is almost always, quote, an encounter with nothing, end quote. And that was certainly the case when looking for surviving accounts of these events written by the African Caribbean population. And I intuited that lack of sources really stemming for two reasons. Firstly, illiteracy. The African Caribbean population, particularly during the period of slavery, was purposely kept illiterate because planters felt that was really essential to maintaining their control. They felt that it limited their capacity for subterfuge and limited their opportunity to gain knowledge about life beyond the plantation they were on. You know, they didn't want the enslaved population reading about the fight for abolition back in Britain, for example. And secondly, the other reason I think there was a very lack of these sources in the archives was that these events often hit, as I will show later, the African Caribbean population the hardest. And my conclusion when doing this research was that they were really driven by a desire to survive. Writing down their experiences was probably not a priority when, unlike their white colonists, you know, African Caribbean accounts were not going to serve as a basis for a compensation claim. Nobody was going to reimburse them if they wrote about what damage they experienced. And they may also have just not chosen to preserve their memories of these events in text. To this day, memory of disaster in the Caribbean continues to be passed down and preserved in varied non-textual forms such as folk songs, dance and stories. So I had to think about then the sources that I did have, and the nature of colonialism as a marginalising, force means that the issue that I was facing wasn't exactly a novel one. This is an issue that many people researching empire, this gap in the sources, face. I found myself drawing on the work of Anne Stoller, particularly her book Along the Grain, and she talks about reading the surfaces at a surface level, but also taking the time to think about and contextualise the obvious gaps in the sources. And I was also drawn to the work of Ranajit Guha, who talks about, quote, sleights of hand, rhetorical sleights of hand in colonial sources and being aware of that. So in lots of these sources, it describes events after these disasters and they say, oh, there's widespread looting. And I was thinking about that in the context of what was actually happening. Well, there was famine conditions, there was a huge shortage of food and provisions. So a lot of what I tried to do with the sources in this book was present the reader with that wider context and say, well, the colonial sources are talking about looting, but there's huge food shortages and these things, and we have to kind of bear that context in mind. So when I first started writing the book, I thought, oh, okay, I'll just have to clarify my kind of theoretical approach and talk about my approach to the sources before then I'll move on to my study of the 19th and early 20th century. As is so often the case, my first reviewer for the book had other ideas. And they said, well, that's great, but for a wider audience, the first question that many people are going to have is, well, how did the people experiencing these events and responding to them understand their origins, right? Did they see them as primarily providential, that's to say acts of God, or natural in origin? So to avoid retreading the ground covered by Mulcahy that I talked about earlier, I wrote actually a new first chapter that focused on examining this shift from kind of providential understandings of disaster to a more scientific or naturalistic understanding of disaster. And I examined primarily, I'll talk about in a second, two defining disasters of early British colonialism in the Caribbean. So the Jamaican earthquake of 1692 and that so-called kind of Great Hurricane of 1780 that I mentioned already. And actually, credit to the reviewer, it was a useful exercise because it brought the continuities and also the uniqueness of disaster response in the 19th century that forms the bulk of the book really into focus. So I start this first chapter, like I say, with an examination of this earthquake in Jamaica in 1692. So in the year of 1692, the capital of Jamaica was not Kingston, as we might be familiar with, but Port Royal. And Port Royal was on a sandbar. So this is Kingston here, not the capital at this point. This is Port Royal here out on a sandbar out into the sea. Good that it's out on a sandbar from a strategic point of view. You've got lines of sight over the harbour. You've got lines of sight out on the ocean. Bad when an earthquake happens. So on the 7th of June, a fatal flaw was revealed in the construction of Port Royal. As I said, this is built literally on sand, this capital, and the vibrations from the earthquake triggered a process called liquefaction. So the foundation that the entire town was built on basically turned to liquid, and it was said within 2 minutes, 9/10 of Port Royal was swallowed up whole by the sea. Buildings, people just vanished, basically, as the very ground turned to liquid and waves burst out of the floor. Given the scale of the disaster and the truly kind of awe-inspiring manner in which it happened, the accounts of it are written through with biblical language. This was understood as an act of God, a providential event. But what I found really interesting was that this narrative about it being an act of God actually turned into an argument that the survivors should not receive any relief. So Port Royal had a bit of a reputation. One English visitor in 1687 described it as, quote, the very Sodom of the universe, end quote. And so after this earthquake in 1692, there's a great need. People are starving, the few people that survive. But there's preachers in Jamaica who say, quote, the only true means for recovering from this disaster and preventing future calamities is a speedy and hearty repentance and amendment, end quote. So they're actually saying, no, we don't need relief. Eventually, a small package of aid was agreed on by Parliament. It was primarily military in nature. Troops were sent to Jamaica with their passage across the Atlantic paid for, but in a preview of some of the sort of conditions that would come attached with relief that happened in the 19th century, their pay would actually end on arriving in Jamaica and only be resumed if they participated in the rebuilding of Port Royal, which was later then abandoned, and then hence Kingston became the capital. But I think what was interesting really is that relief in this case was not primarily really about ameliorating suffering. It was a pragmatic military exercise. Moving forward then a century, it was quite clear how understandings of disaster had changed. So as I mentioned, in 1780, Jamaica and the Windward Island chain, that's a chain of islands on the East Caribbean that contains Barbados and St. Vincent, amongst others, were hit by a hurricane, retrospectively categorized as possibly one of the most damaging ever recorded in Caribbean history. It's thought it claimed around 22,000 lives, and the contemporary estimates of the damage put it around £1.7 million, a lot of money for the time. There's very few visual representations of the hurricane, but this quite beautiful print shows us the dismasting of HMS Egmont. Britain actually lost 15 military ships, with a further 9 suffering severe damage. Some American military historians have said that this might have actually influenced the outcome of the Battle of Yorktown because the British fleet was so depleted, but not my specialism, but interesting. Unlike in 1692, where there was actually debate about whether we should send for relief to Britain or not, the planters in the Caribbean very quickly got together and put a petition together, and the petition ends with the line, quote, "It pleased divine providence lately to visit the British West India Islands with this terrible disaster," end quote. But actually the body of the text of this petition makes it very clear that they understood this as a natural event, right? They were not going to indicate at this point that it was an act of God. That would have in some way suggested, oh, we deserve this, and they weren't going to do that. Indeed, they were really at pains to describe this as an event that, quote, "no human prudence could provide for," end quote, that they couldn't have prepared for in any way, basically. So they send this petition across the Atlantic, and like I say, in lots of this text from this event, it's very clear they did not understand this as an act of God anymore. But what was quite interesting was, and this kind of gets to one of the main themes of the book, they're obviously worried about the African Caribbean population, and one planter in particular, a very wealthy planter, William Beckford, he really actually complains that unlike in 1692, when there was all this visual damage to Port Royal, he complains that the hurricane damage in 1780 would only leave a temporary mark and not a permanent mark that, quote, "still taught the infidel to believe," end quote. So and this is an interesting theme, is that they're really concerned about using these events, the fear of these events, as a disciplining tool on the African Caribbean population. Like, they don't understand them as act of God, the white wealthy planters, but they want to really impress on the African Caribbean population. They are acts of God, and you should be terrified, and you should effectively get back in line in this post-disaster moment. So in the case of 1780, relief did arrive eventually. Parliament would go on to provide a record aid package that far exceeded anything it had provided in the 18th century. It was not military aid as in 1692, but targeted financial aid aimed primarily at restoring the productive capacities of the island. So Parliament allotted £120,000 for Jamaica and Barbados, £80,000 for Barbados, which was considered worse hit, and £40,000 for Jamaica. As you might guess, this fell far short of the £1.7 million that was estimated by the planters. And this kind of brings into focus really the contours of how this financial aid was debated or negotiated through the 19th century, in that the planters submit an estimate to Parliament. Parliament goes, "No, we don't really trust you. I don't think you're probably overestimating how much there is." And Parliament supplies a far lower amount. And this is a pattern that repeats throughout the 19th century. Indeed, the Prime Minister at the time of 1780, Lord North, said planters should not, quote, "expect a total indemnification for their losses." And he argued, perhaps rather speciously, that if they were to make these colonies whole, how would Britain protect itself if there was a hurricane in Britain next month? It's, quite a weak argument, but this is the point that he's making, right? And I think what's interesting about this is that providing relief in 1780, it made good political sense, right? The planters actually during the American War of Independence, they'd actually been quite vocal, some of them, about their dislike of British policy, and they'd actually suggested maybe we should go with America and join, the War of Independence. So it made sense to remind them of the value of staying with Britain. But even then, in that kind of political context, Parliament still provided a lot less money than they ever estimated. So this kind of describes the first chapter and kind of set out some of the kind of contours and key themes of relief. But as I was doing this research, this relationship between the planters and Parliament was not the only relationship, it kind of appeared to me, that was shaping responses to disaster. And I felt I was looking through this, and there was a couple of these repeated crises. I kept on noticing that after these events in the 19th century, there was always food shortages, and there was always shortages of building materials. Planters and colonial officials kept on facing these same challenges, but seemingly doing nothing in the long term to resolve them. Right? They'd moved away from seeing disasters as act of God. So I was thinking, did it not make sense for them to prepare? At the very least for hurricanes, right? Hurricanes happen every single year, but I was not seeing any evidence of preparation. And so I kind of took a focus into looking at the relationship between the planters and the environment that they lived in, because I thought that might provide some of the clues. And what I found was that the vision of the planters and later the colonial officials that replaced them, as the kind of the power of the planters waned towards the end of the 19th century, their vision for the Caribbean was extremely narrow, right? Despite living there, they never saw the Caribbean as a place for permanent settlement, but rather as a place from which to solely extract profit. And in the book, I refer to this as a, quote, plantation mindset, end quote. And it's this mindset that really made these colonies more vulnerable to disaster, but it also stalled developments that would have made them more resistant to these hazards. And the vulnerabilities, in particular, the frequent food and material shortages that I mentioned, actually arose, as I found during the course of the research, from the monopoly that plantation agriculture had on all arable land, right? After some early experiments in growing tobacco on Barbados, which was universally regarded as horrible tobacco in the 17th century, sugar, as you probably know, became the chosen crop of the planters in the region, right? But monocultures, by virtue of their unnaturalness, for lack of a better word, take immense labour to create and maintain, hence slavery playing such a central role in the agriculture. And these islands, Barbados in particular, as you can see in this image, was subject to severe deforestation to clear the space for plantations. Other crops were marginalised, and the colonies themselves quickly became really dependent on imports, both to feed themselves and for timber for construction. So this, as you can imagine, this import dependence became a glaring vulnerability when disaster hit. Colonies were often quickly cut off from the places they could import, and potential for local reciprocity was difficult because hurricanes often hit multiple islands at once. And so the monopoly of the plantation played a central role in prolonging recovery and creating the shortages that then ratcheted up the social tensions in the aftermath of disaster. And when I was writing this chapter, I turned away from some of the governmental sources and looked a lot actually at travel literature. Again, it was primarily written by wealthy white elites, but it did really provide some unique insights by virtue of it being authored by external visitors to the Caribbean. And it showed, lots of this literature showed that the dominance of the plantation not only made them vulnerable because of this import dependence, but it also worsened the impacts of these hazards themselves. So mass deforestation took away the natural anchors of the soil. So when hurricanes and their rain arrived, there was landslides, there was extreme subsidence that swallowed livestock, that swallowed buildings, and deforestation also took away the windbreaks. It left everybody exposed to higher winds and with very little shelter when their houses blew away, which they often did. Now, it must be said that the planters did try and offset some of this inherent vulnerability from their import dependence. They allowed the enslaved population some allotment grounds to grow their own food, but these were often relegated to the most marginal soils. They weren't going to give up good soil for sugars to the enslaved. And the planters themselves gave them very little time to actually to plant and attend to these allotments. And what's interesting, actually, and comes through a lot of this travel literature, is that enslaved peoples rarely tended to grow crops that were resilient to the winds, like yams and other tubers that were deep-rooted, but they grew crops that they could get high monetary value for. They obviously looking towards their own economic agency, so they primarily planted plantains and corn and these sorts of things. Interestingly, it's kind of clear that once slavery ended, they transitioned primarily to planting for themselves and not for monetary gain. And there was a point when I was doing this research and I was thinking, am I being anachronistic? Right? I'm pointing out all these inherent vulnerabilities. I'm kind of coming from this perspective of critical disaster studies. But what really struck me in this travel literature was the extent to which, contemporary people in the 19th century were also picking up on this, right? So one visitor to Dominica in 1837, he asked a planter and said, why do you allow such a precarious import situation to persist? And he received the reply that, quote, there is no surplus labour to devote to such minor matters. The sugar and coffee cultivation absorb all the resources of the island, end quote. Another famous early botanist, Alexander Anderson, in his 1799 book, Geography and History of St. Vincent, expressed frustration at what he called the fruitless deforestation that meant that the island had to import timber at vast expense and on a precarious footing. In the same text, he also stressed the importance of allowing trees to grow because it screened the land from storms. And interestingly, similarly, in 1807, a new governor of Tobago tried to persuade the planters to stockpile food and to prepare for storms, and they weren't interested. So the question to me really arose, why were they so resistant to building resilience when there's such obvious vulnerabilities in how these islands were structured? And the answer I arrived at, or kind of hinted at already, was like they never saw these places as a place for long-term settlement. Indeed, as a Victorian author, James Froude, looking back on Britain's colonisation of the Caribbean at the end of the 19th century, he said, quote, the English have built those islands as if they were but passing visitors wanting only tenements to be occupied for a short time, end quote. Once the planters had built their plantations, for the most part, they prioritised returning to Britain, and they put their fortunes to work at home in Britain and not in the Caribbean. Unlike, as I show in the book, their French counterparts, who actually tended to see the Caribbean as their home. The British planters dreamed of being absentees. Even when they did live in the Caribbean, the British, when they were forced to live there, they did all they could to retain their fashion, as you can see in this illustration here, their diet and even their types of architecture, despite the heat. So steadfast was their need to maintain their Britishness, adaptations such as hurricane shelters that were initially copied from colonists in North America were eventually abandoned, seemingly because they presented too Creole a form of architecture. It was an embarrassment, the hurricane shelter, because it wasn't British enough, basically. So this meant that those who were in control of the direction of the Caribbean society were absentees. Disasters primarily threatened their profits rather than their lives. They refused to bankroll even the most basic adaptations. I found in the archives a long series of discussions about financing a lighthouse on Barbados, a fairly basic adaptation, and the sort of adaptation that will allow you to receive food in a storm. The lighthouse is going to guide ships in. Not interested. Meanwhile, as I show in the book, colonists on the coastline of North America, the people who very much did see that place as their home, were shaping their urban centres to make them more storm resistant. And indeed, there's famous examples even back in the 18th century, big capitals. Lisbon is destroyed by an earthquake in 1755, And they spend much time rebuilding Lisbon in the most seismically kind of responsible way that they could in 1755. And indeed, the archaeological evidence that I looked at shows us that indigenous societies in the Caribbean, so predating European colonists, built settlements in respect of the region's hazards and developed complex systems of reciprocity that went into action when various people, when they were affected by these hazards. So totalizing was this plantation mindset that by the end of the 19th century, when planter power began to wane, and there was a new colonial secretary, Joseph Chamberlain, who was looking very much to revive the region. He's not a planter, but his frame of reference is that the Caribbean should be plantations. His great idea for reviving the Caribbean is that we should plant different crops on the plantations. It's like, okay, sugar is a bust now because there's beet sugar in European, that market's dead, so we should just plant different crops on plantations, but we should still have plantations. So this plantation mindset, I think, is a brilliant example. Going back to the critical disaster studies, it's often argued that disasters are the product of, quote, failed or skewed development, end quote. And the British Caribbean could, to my mind, not be a more perfect example of how skewed development increased the vulnerability of these colonies to disaster. The plantation mindset effectively locked these colonies into a form of stasis, and to borrow the terminology of a great Caribbean writer, Walter Rodney, underdeveloped the region. Now, as I've gone to show, this plantation mindset also had profound consequences for how these societies responded to disaster in the immediate moments and the days and the weeks after. And it really indelibly shaped the type of relief that was provided to the African Caribbean population. So this image is essentially commissioned as a piece of slavery propaganda by the planters. Abolition has happened in 1807, but they're doing all they can to forestall emancipation, which later happens in 1833. So this picture is like, British people, don't worry, look how beautiful and orderly things are on the plantation. We don't need emancipation. You got 1807, let's leave it at that. So this is a very sanitized picture of plantation life, but it's quite a good visual representation about the role that the plantation played in Caribbean life as a nexus of control. Right, the plantation dictated the rhythms of everyday life. Its work routines dictated when people woke up, who they spoke to during the day, and when they could rest. The open vistas created by deforestation and the building of watchtowers allowed overseers and other whites to constantly surveil the enslaved population. Movement on and off the plantation was also highly controlled, requiring a signed pass by a master or an overseer. And all these layers of security existed to sustain white minority control. And if you're not familiar with just how small a minority that could be, I'll give you a snapshot taken from a census on St. Vincent in 1812. In that year, the enslaved population on the island numbered 22,000, and the white population numbered 827. So huge imbalances. And this is one of the primary, the fascinating things about these disasters is that the hurricanes, the earthquakes, the eruptions destroyed all these complex security arrangements that facilitated this minority control. As you might guess then, white elites' short-term responses to disaster were primarily shaped by a fear of rebellion. And so at the heart of their response to disaster was the restoration of order. What did that look like? Well, the whole edifice of white control in the Caribbean, even after slavery, rested on, both figuratively and literally, the labour of the African Caribbean population. This meant that white elites, after disasters, often focused all their efforts on trying to get the African Caribbean population into that position of labouring again. For them, for the whites, labour acted as they saw it, a natural disciplining force on the African Caribbean population. But how do you force people to resubmit to minority control after a disaster like this, after a moment where colonialism seems weak and threatened? Well, the answer is that whites leveraged the suffering created by these events and used it in combination with the control they could exert over relief to basically withhold that relief until the African Caribbean population agreed to start labouring. So as I've mentioned, you often see all these big food shortages after these events, and so they basically say, unless you submit to labour, you will starve. And they exercise that control. And I think what's really interesting, looking at the language they use through the 19th century, is that this cruelty, right, of making relief highly conditional in these dire circumstances was not just a product of the racist paradigm of British colonialism in the Caribbean. It also reflected changing approaches to relief back in Britain. Right? In 1834, we have the new Poor Law, or the Poor Law Amendment Act, and that codified a far more rigid and Malthusian approach to poor relief in Britain, categorising claimants according to whether they were deserving, undeserving, or able-bodied. And it also enshrined the principle of, quote, less eligibility, end quote, that aimed to make claiming state relief wholly undesirable and very much a last resort. And you see all of this language that arises from the Poor Law Act filter through into these sources in the Caribbean. And I'll zoom in now on a particular event. So there was a hurricane at Barbados in 1831, and the response there really crystallized so many of these themes. So a hurricane hits the island on the 11th of August 1831, and the initial reports detail that there's mass casualties, there's starvation facing those who survive, and the first recorded response of the governor, pictured here in this record from the National Archives, was a proclamation that called for the white population to, quote, exert themselves to the utmost of their power in preserving on this melancholy occasion peace and tranquility of the island, and to prevent the depredation and plunder by such evil-disposed persons, end quote. And he went on to call the militia, membership of which was restricted to whites, to assemble for the purposes of preventing disturbances and preserving the general peace. In a later second proclamation, this time published in the island's colonial newspaper, he called upon all whites to focus their efforts on recapturing the, quote, vagrant enslaved people who had left their plantations, and ordered them to put them to work immediately at a number of hastily created public works schemes. And in his own private communications back to London, the governor really fretted about the enslaved population's apathy and unwillingness to work, end quote, and of their, quote, strong inclination to pilfer and steal, end quote. And I can't help but highlight the obvious, right? These are people who've lost loved ones, who are starving, who have nothing in this moment, and this is how they are talked about in these sources. The governor himself went on to patrol the island with an armed militia. He turns up to plantations and flogs the enslaved who refuse to go back to work. Later, somebody is shot for stockpiling some food in their hut that survived, because the primary focus here is on trying to get them to get back to working, right? And so severe was this need to kind of control them and put them back to work that some relief actually arrives on a ship full of provisions from nearby Berbice, but it never left the ship because they couldn't get the white men together to guard the ship to ensure that they could control that distribution, and they weren't willing to distribute it freely, so they left the food to rot on the ship while the enslaved population starved. In 1898, the Windwards, but again particularly Barbados and St. Vincent, were hit by another hurricane, and they faced similar challenges. Again, famine-like conditions are reported throughout the island. There was a meagre distribution of some provisions in the first 48 hours, but immediately the records show us that the colonial officials put their efforts into turning, quote, away all the able-bodied men and instead putting them to work to avoid, quote, social disorder. Such was their fear of unrest that a warship was even held back from other duties and stationed off St. Vincent because, as a naval officer at the time put it, quote, riots may at any moment show themselves if there is no adequate protection, as there are hundreds of African Caribbean loafers about the towns who have no employment and would not work if the employment were offered to them, but are ready to get all they can by thieving and inciting others to disturb the peace, end quote. Later, to claim any relief, those able-bodied peoples were put to work clearing roads, removing bodies, repairing agricultural irrigation systems. A month later, after this hurricane, there was discussion in colonial records that Imports were still insufficient to meet the needs, but they were still nonetheless finding ways to try and discourage people from collecting any relief. Later, in another example, I'll talk a bit more in detail later, when an earthquake hit Jamaica again in 1907, African Caribbean people found themselves again forced to labour for any relief, but this time in an urban environment where there was so much more fear about racial violence, they were actually forced to labour under armed guard of British troops, again to achieve to obtain any relief. And I think there was a theme here for me that showed even after the period of slavery, moments of disaster became periods of exception, where the freedoms gained from slavery could be rolled back to try and maintain control at all costs. And the other thing that I found really interesting doing this research about these short-term responses, that despite all the white fears of a rebellion, I never found evidence of one. There was no unrest. And there was certainly unrest at other points in the 19th century. There's a very famous rebellion in Jamaica in 1865, the Morant Bay Rebellion. But after any of these events in the 19th and early 20th century, there was none. There was no rebellion, even when at these moments colonialism seemed so weak. And my conclusion was that as much as colonialism was at its weakest, the very people who might be in a position to incite and rebel were also at the weakest. They are starving and they are depleted physically and mentally. And the other thing, looking at these short-term responses, that I found really interesting was that from the outside, the colonial officials are enforcing these really stringent conditions on relief, but privately in the documents, they're quite scared about how far they can push these kind of stringent requirements on relief. And sometimes they did take it too far. In the Bahamas in 1866, there was a hurricane, and one colonial official found himself threatened with lynching because he tried to sell the relief to the people who were starving instead of even distributing it if they agreed to work. He tried to sell it when they were starving, and he had to backpedal from that case. In effect, throughout the 19th and early 20th century, there was a begrudging acceptance on the behalf of the colonial regime that they did have to provide relief, but they kind of engaged in this informal negotiation about how stringent they could be with the conditions that they attached to it. And interestingly, as much as there was begrudging acceptance about relief for the African Caribbean population, there was also a begrudging acceptance on the behalf of Parliament's relationship to providing relief to the Caribbean colonies. As I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, the financial relief provided by Parliament to the Caribbean colonies after these disasters never met the estimates made by planters. There was always mistrust between planters and Parliament. And even, particularly once the abolitionists had triumphed in 1807, the planters were regularly lampooned in British cartoons, as we can see here on the screen. The 19th century, so the main part of the study of this book, saw the planters lose their grasp on public sentiment and political power in Britain. And indeed, over the course of the 19th and early 20th century, that mistrust intensified, and some within Parliament even pushed, at least rhetorically, to just abandon the Caribbean colonies. That is until one case, which I'll talk about, when geopolitical circumstances would change that calculation. Planters themselves throughout this period are really aware of the mistrust that Parliament had of their estimates of the losses from these events and how severe they said they were. So they had to engage in this really lengthy and quite risky negotiation with Parliament. They had to write petitions that would say, we're in a dire state, so they could elicit that sympathy, but they couldn't say that it was too bad to suggest that they couldn't handle the situation. And of course, they wanted to be the ones who controlled that relief when it did arrive. And so you often see interesting, this is one petition from St. Vincent in 1812. It begins with the line, quote, "This is written by persons entirely disinterested with the estates," end quote, but goes on rather conspicuously to ask for lots of money to help revive the estates. And other petitions that I found, Dominica in 1834 was a bit more hyperbolic and quote, The mother country must come forward to offer help with a generous hand, or cultivation will cease forever, end quote, on the island. Right? The planters knew they were in this difficult battle, and sometimes Parliament went as far to kind of demand some bizarre investigations. I found a really small claim from a planter who wanted reimbursement for 3 horses that had died during a hurricane, and Parliament sent somebody to try and investigate whether the corpses of the horses had indicated whether they died by a hurricane impact or by some other means, and he was trying to scam Parliament. And this whole process of relief from Parliament, there was no framework, and so it was all in flux. It depended on how important the colony in particular was perceived and what that relationship was like between the planters and Parliament. When it did arrive, it usually came in 2 forms. There was grants in aid, as they were called, and loans. Grants were supplied a big, large sum, with a loose stipulation, rarely enforced, that they be spent on the poor and needy. Loans were often far larger sums, supplied with a whole host of conditions that excluded small landowners and the African Caribbean population. They're primarily targeted at the plantation owners. And in the Caribbean, these loans had a reputation. Quoting here from one member of a council in Tobago, said, "Even when circumstances are dire, generally speaking, these loans entail much suffering on the community and are never applied to the purposes intended and should not be resorted to under the most pressure of urgent necessity." And the other thing that I found really interesting when I was looking at this, you have mistrust from Parliament about the amount of money they're going to send. But when they did send money, there was very little oversight on how it was distributed or spent, right? So in 1836, a man, Joseph Sturge, who was no friend of the planters, he goes to visit Barbados 5 years after that hurricane in 1831 and finds that it had not been spent in any satisfactory means. Most people had just spent it shoring up their mortgages that they'd had on their plantation owners, while lots of people continued to live in really desperate hunger. And another visitor to Dominica in 1834 said that planters openly declared their intention of never repaying the loans, end quote. We can see perhaps then some of that mistrust. And over the course of the 19th century, as I said, the distaste for the Caribbean colonies certainly picked up in Parliament. After there was a discussion about relief for Tobago, which had suffered a hurricane in 1847, one MP in Parliament said, quote, "I utterly disbelieve that the West Indian colonies can ever be of the slightest value to the country. They have been the most costly, the most worthless, and the worst managed of our colonies, a perpetual drain on the pockets of the people of England." End quote. Another MP, after that hurricane in 1898 that I mentioned, goes on the parliamentary record ridiculing the sort of damage. He says, quote, "If you heard of 10,000 houses in England being destroyed by a hurricane, you would stand aghast. But the houses on Barbados are simply bamboo huts. No doubt a great deal of injury has been done, but it is of only a temporary character, because these huts which have been destroyed can be built again for £1 or £2. And when we talk of people being rendered homeless, I myself have been homeless, in the sense of sometimes sleeping under a tree when I slept just as well as I could have done in a house." End quote. Colonial officials themselves never voiced this disdain for the Caribbean colonies, but it was clear by the end of the 19th century they were willing to exert more stringency over relief to the Caribbean. Interestingly, after the hurricane in 1898, I found a clause in one of the loans that said if there was misuse of the loan, the planter themselves could be subject to 6 months hard labour. So quite a change from the early 19th century, when they were essentially left to do what they want with those loans. As I've mentioned, towards the end of the 19th century, there was some stirrings to try and find a way to revive the Caribbean colonies, and lots of these clauses about controlling the distribution of relief align with that desire to exert more control over the Caribbean and have more, like I say, direct oversight. But, as was so often the case, these ideas were overtaken by events. What the Colonial Office could not do was exert direct control over how officials responded in the heat of the moment after these disasters. In 1907, when an earthquake, as I mentioned, hit Jamaica, primarily destroying Kingston, British disaster was, for the first time in the region, subject to some intense external scrutiny. So on the 14th of January 1907, Kingston is devastated by an earthquake. The initial shocks of the earthquake destroyed much of the urban environment, but this was worsened when a fire broke out. It's estimated at least 1,000 people died on the first day alone. And as you can see from this picture here, the initial response was to deploy troops all round what remained of Kingston, like these troops here guarding this bank. Now, Jamaica had long been considered the most important British colony in the Caribbean, and at the end of the 19th century, it was one of the only colonies which had diversified its economy away from sugar, and it had now a new prosperity. Particularly with the Panama Canal set to open, there was a belief that Jamaica was going to be a new entrepot for trade in the region. There were, however, at the same time, concerns about the loyalty of the island's business community, who owed much of their post-plantation fortunes to trade with the United States. When the earthquake struck, the governor, Alexander Swetnam, who we can see here on the right, sent a quick telegram to a British minister in Cuba, and the minister, knowing that there was a much reduced naval presence for Britain in the region, decided, rather fatefully, to send a telegram to the Americans and said, basically, can you help us out? The British ships won't get to Kingston in time to help people. And it was the American Navy's Rear Admiral Davis, who we can see here on the left, who reached the island first. And we can see the two depicted here from newspaper coverage. Upon landing in Kingston, he found a very chaotic situation, and he deemed it necessary to deploy with himself a force of armed Navy bluejackets to protect himself, the supplies that he was bringing, and later the US consulate. 2 days after his arrival, Davis left. At great embarrassment to Britain, he'd been possibly quite rudely asked to leave by the governor. Swetnam, the governor, had argued he'd not been made aware of the Admiral's arrival. No permission was given for him to land or to send armed troops through Kingston. And what perhaps stung them most was that there was praise not just from Kingston's American community, but Kingston's British community for the actions undertaken by the Admiral. Now, I had my own suspicions about Swetnam's exact motives for turning away the Admiral, but he didn't leave a diary or anything quite that useful. So you can imagine my excitement when, on one very warm afternoon in an archive in Jamaica, I found a document quite literally titled, quote, "The Secret History of the Earthquake," end quote, which I see, for a historian to find something that's titled "The Secret History." Oh, yeah, it almost seemed too good to be true. But this document contained a first-hand, never-before-seen account of the relationship between these two, what happened. And in effect, what it describes really was Swetnam as a man out of time. He wanted to construct the relief effort in 1907 in the mould of those that came before him. In his own words, he wanted to keep Jamaica dependent on the, quote, mother country. He turned away thousands, tens of thousands of pounds of charitable donations from America, from Canada, because he wanted to control that relief effort and maximise his control. Davis went as far to offer to supply the local hospital with staff and medicine, and he refused it. This might have worked in 1831, where Atlantic communication took weeks and months. It's not going to work in the era of rapid telegrams and media scrutiny. And many of the Kingston's business community were terribly shocked by his hostility to American support. And interestingly, instead of support from the Colonial Office from his actions, they sacked him very quickly. Interestingly, I found a note from Winston Churchill, who himself was working in the Colonial Office, and he said, "We need to sack him immediately. We'll say it was about old age, but it's not really. We need to sack him." Because this was a moment at which Britain is building new relationships with Roosevelt, and this was a deeply, deeply embarrassing moment. Swetnam and his actions did not occur in a vacuum. They were at the far end of this continuum of British disaster response in the region that never put human suffering first. Negotiations over relief expenditure and social order and sovereignty played the most important roles in shaping British responses to disaster in the region. I will finish there, and I will show you one last image of one of the few buildings the Giddy House, as it is called, that survived the earthquake of 1907. It's subject to liquefaction, so that's why it's slipped into the earth, and now it's a popular tourist destination. People go in there and they try and take a selfie with the floor being like that, and it's now a bit of a tourist place to visit, which, you know, there's probably a comment there thinking about how people view the seriousness of disaster and the potential for another earthquake in Jamaica.